September 18th, 1943, Millbrook, Oregon. English teacher Cordelia Harlan sat at her desk in the empty classroom, staring at a stack of composition books with blue marbled covers. Standard school notebooks, wide-ruled, each one labeled in ink. Citizen Speech Observation Journal. 41 notebooks, one for each student in her 6th grade class. She had distributed them to the children 23 days ago, on August 26th, the first day of the new school year. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable patriotic exercise. Now, looking at those blue covers, Cordelia understood that she had turned 41 children into government informants, and that 3 parents of these children had vanished, not by accident. Outside, rain hammered against the windows. Cold Pacific rain, the kind that turned dirt roads to mud and made the world feel small and trapped. The drops beat against the glass like Morse code tapping out an indictment. Cordelia opened the first notebook at random. The handwriting belonged to Daphne Pruitt, a girl from the 3rd row. Quiet, careful, with braids pinned around her head. September 2nd. Father said to Mother, "These damn bureaucrats are raising meat prices again while boys are dying overseas." Error. The word damn is profane, and criticizing our government during wartime undermines morale and the war effort. Cordelia closed her eyes. Daphne's father, Wallace Pruitt, worked at the lumber mill outside town. Yesterday, 2 men in dark suits had arrived at his house. FBI, people whispered, though no one said it aloud. Wallace had gone with them, quote, to, about his loyalties. He had not returned. His wife sat at home with 3 younger children, bewildered and terrified. And Cordelia understood why. She understood too well, and the understanding sat in her stomach like a stone. To understand how an ordinary small-town English teacher became complicit in a system that transformed children into surveillance instruments against their own parents, you need to go back 2 months, to that scorching August day when a new principal arrived at Millbrook Elementary. The summer of 1943 was unusually hot for Oregon. The Willamette Valley sweltered under temperatures more typical of California. Crops withered in fields already short-handed because so many young men had gone to war. Millbrook lay 40 miles south of Portland, tucked between forested hills and the railroad line that connected it to the outside world. The town had 800 residents, most working in timber or at the small aircraft parts factory that had opened the previous year to support the war effort. Cordelia Harlan had lived in Millbrook her entire life. She was 36 years old. Born there in 1907, educated in the very school where she now taught, she had briefly attended normal school in Salem before returning home to teach. That was 1929, the year the world fell apart economically. The year her father lost his hardware store. The year her mother took sick and never fully recovered. Cordelia had taught English and literature at Millbrook Elementary for 14 years now. She had never married. There had been one romance with a railroad engineer named Vernon, but he'd been transferred to Wyoming, and gradually his letters had stopped coming. Cordelia had buried that disappointment deep and built a life of routine. Wake at 6, teach school from 8 until 3:30, grade papers, listen to war news on the radio, read novels borrowed from the county library, sleep. A quiet life, but her own. Everything changed on August 12, 1943. That afternoon, a black Chevrolet sedan pulled up to the school building. 3 men emerged. An older man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of a military officer, a younger man in a government suit, and a third carrying a briefcase. Cordelia was watering the Victory Garden beside the front steps. Tomatoes and beans the students tended to support the war effort. The man in the suit approached first. He introduced himself as Theodore Granville, Regional Coordinator for the Office of War Information. His companion, he explained, was Principal Designate Silas Oakes, who would be assuming leadership of Millbrook Elementary immediately. The previous principal, elderly Mr. Whitmore, was retiring due to health concerns. Silas Oakes stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair cut military short and eyes that assessed everything with cold precision. When he looked at Cordelia, she felt X-rayed, catalogued, filed. He nodded curtly, shook her hand with a grip that bordered on painful, and surveyed the school building as though inspecting troops. The staff assembled that same evening at 7 o'clock in the teacher's lounge. All 8 instructors attended, including Cordelia's colleague Maud Stevens, who taught primary grades and had been at the school since before the Great War. Silas Oakes spoke for exactly 50 minutes. He talked about educational standards, about the critical importance of maintaining civilian morale during wartime, about the school's duty to produce not merely literate citizens, but loyal Americans capable of recognizing and resisting enemy propaganda. He spoke about the war in Europe and the Pacific, about boys from this very town fighting and dying, about the absolute necessity of unity on the home front. He said the American school system was not simply a place to learn reading and arithmetic. It was the front line of the ideological battle, the factory that produced patriotic citizens capable of defending democracy. Every teacher, he declared, bore responsibility not only for their students' knowledge, but for the soundness of their thinking, their loyalty, their Americanism. Cordelia listened and felt increasing unease. The words themselves were conventional enough. Everyone talked about patriotism and loyalty these days, but something in the man's delivery unsettled her. He spoke with the cold conviction of someone accustomed to absolute authority, someone who would tolerate no deviation from his vision. After the meeting, Silas Oakes called Cordelia into the principal's office, which still smelled of Mr. Whitmore's pipe tobacco. The new principal sat behind the desk and opened a manila folder. Cordelia Harlan, he read, 36 years old, teacher of English and literature, 14 years service, unmarried, no party affiliation, generally satisfactory performance, but certain concerns have been noted. Cordelia felt her pulse accelerate. What concerns? Oakes looked up. Insufficient attention to patriotic themes in your curriculum. Last spring, you assigned your students to write essays about an important person in my life. Do you recall what one of your students, a boy named Curtis Brennan, wrote about? Cordelia remembered. Curtis had written about his grandfather, a veteran of the Spanish-American War who now ran a small dairy farm and told stories about Cuba. The essay had been vivid, personal, honest. Curtis wrote about his grandfather, she said, a man who barely survived yellow fever, who watched comrades die of disease, who came home broken and spent 40 years farming because that's all he could do, Oakes said flatly. Not Douglas MacArthur, not Theodore Roosevelt, not even a successful businessman or scientist. A small-time farmer with no particular distinction. You gave that essay an excellent grade without noting the missed opportunity to instill proper values. Cordelia wanted to object, to argue that the boy had written about genuine experience, real memory, authentic connection. Wasn't that what writing was supposed to be? But the words stuck in her throat. Oakes watched her with those assessing eyes. Quote, 10, he continued, his tone moderating slightly. Quote, 11. Cordelia walked home that evening feeling as though she'd been interrogated. She lived in a small house 3 blocks from the school, a white clapboard place with a sagging porch that had belonged to her parents. Inside, she sat by the radio and stared at nothing. The 9 o'clock news reported Allied advances in Sicily, submarine warfare in the Atlantic, rationing updates. Normal wartime news. But Cordelia felt as though something had fundamentally shifted. Silas Oakes hadn't threatened her, hadn't raised his voice, but she felt pressure nonetheless. Atmospheric, invisible, like the weight of air before a thunderstorm. That night she dreamed she stood before her classroom, but the children's faces were blank, featureless, and they wrote continuously in notebooks without ever looking up. And she couldn't see what they were writing, but knew with terrible certainty it was something monstrous. The staff meeting was held on August 20th, 6 days before school reopened. Everyone attended, teachers, custodians, even the school cook, Mrs. Kowalski. Silas Oakes spoke for 90 minutes. He described a new program developed, he claimed, by educational experts in Washington working with the Office of War Information. It was called the __quote_12_____. The concept was straightforward. Each student would receive a special notebook to record instances of improper speech they encountered in daily life. At home, in stores, at church, anywhere. The stated goal was to develop critical thinking, attention to language, and awareness of how careless words could undermine national morale and security. Oakes was persuasive. He cited studies, referenced programs supposedly running in schools across the country, showed charts indicating improved quote 13 in participating schools. Cordelia found herself half convinced. Children did pick up bad language from adults. Wartime had made people anxious, and anxious people said reckless things. Perhaps teaching children to be more thoughtful about language wasn't inherently wrong, but then Oakes added, students should pay particular attention to statements that could be classified as defeatist, unpatriotic, or sympathetic to enemy powers. Criticism of our government, our military leaders, our allies, spreading rumors about defeats or casualties, questioning rationing or other home front requirements, expressing sympathy for Japanese or German civilians. These are not merely speech errors, they're potential security risks. Children will record them, teachers will review them, and serious cases will be referred to appropriate authorities for follow-up and education. And there it was. This wasn't about grammar or civics, this was about surveillance. Cordelia felt cold understanding wash through her. She glanced around the room. Young Miss Carlyle, fresh out of teacher's college, was nodding enthusiastically. The history teacher, Mr. Drummond, a staunch Roosevelt supporter, beamed approval. Only Maud Stevens looked troubled, her weathered face creased with doubt. Cordelia wanted to speak up, to object. But what would she say? That teaching children to recognize defeatist talk was wrong? During wartime, when everyone was supposed to be vigilant, she would sound unpatriotic. Worse, she would mark herself as someone requiring closer scrutiny. So she said nothing. And that silence, she would later understand, was her first betrayal. The first day of school arrived on August 26th, hot and cloudless. 41 students filed into Cordelia's 6th grade classroom, farm children, mill workers' kids, a few from families that owned businesses in town. Good kids, mostly. Cordelia had taught some of their older siblings. She knew their families, their circumstances, their struggles. She distributed the blue notebooks as instructed, explained the assignment using the language Oakes had provided. You're going to help the war effort by learning to recognize words that hurt our country. When you hear someone say something that doesn't sound right, criticism of our leaders, complaints about rationing, spreading rumors, anything that makes our nation seem weak or wrong, you'll write it down. Not to get anyone in trouble, but to learn what proper patriotic speech sounds like. The children accepted the notebooks with solemn faces. They were used to patriotic lessons, to war bond drives, to victory gardens, to teachers who emphasized duty and sacrifice. This seemed like more of the same. Cordelia collected their first entries 3 days later on August 29th. Most were innocuous. Neighbors complaining about gas rationing, shopkeepers grousing about supply shortages, grandparents saying the coffee tasted terrible since rationing began. Standard wartime griping, but 3 entries made her pause. Young Herman Vogt, son of German immigrants who'd anglicized their name from Vogel, wrote, Bernard Fitzpatrick recorded. And Daphne Pruitt's first entry. Father said the government wastes money while soldiers go without supplies. Error. Criticizing government efficiency undermines trust in our leaders. Cordelia sat at her desk that afternoon and stared at these entries. She had marked them with red pencil, correcting spelling errors, noting grammar mistakes. She had written, good observation, next to each identification of improper speech. She had done exactly what Silas Oakes instructed, but her hands shook as she closed the notebooks. These were children reporting their parents' private kitchen table conversations. She told herself it was innocent, educational. Surely no one would actually act on such trivial complaints. Surely the point was just to raise awareness, not to punish. She was wrong. On September 4th, 8 days after school began, Herman Vought's mother received a visit from two FBI agents. They questioned her about her loyalties, her background, whether she maintained contact with relatives in Germany, whether she harbored sympathy for the Nazi regime. The interview lasted 3 hours. Mrs. Vaught, a timid woman who spoke English with a slight accent, was terrified. Word spread through town quickly. Millbrook was small and news traveled. People whispered about spies, fifth columnists, the necessity of vigilance. But Cordelia knew the truth. Mrs. Vaught's file had been flagged because her 12-year-old son had dutifully recorded her moment of human sympathy in a blue notebook. Cordelia wanted to believe it was coincidence. Perhaps someone else had reported concerns. Perhaps the FBI was conducting routine checks on all German immigrants. But she couldn't convince herself. The timing was too precise, too immediate. She had collected the notebooks on August 29th. She had turned them over to Principal Oakes on August 30th for his review. By September 4th, FBI agents were at the Vaught house. 5 days. That wasn't coincidence. That was a system operating exactly as designed. She collected the second round of entries on September 5th. More of the same. Complaints about rationing, worries about the war's duration, private expressions of doubt and fear. Each entry a potential trigger. Each notebook a loaded weapon pointed at a family. That weekend, September 11th and 12th, Cordelia barely slept. She lay awake both nights, staring at her ceiling, replaying the moment she'd distributed those notebooks, the moment she'd explained the assignment, the moment she'd validated children reporting their parents. What had she done? On Monday, September 13th, Bernard Fitzpatrick's Uncle Patrick, a local insurance agent known for his loudly held political opinions, was called before a loyalty review board and questioned about his views on the Roosevelt administration, his support for the war effort, his attitudes toward government authority. He returned home shaken, warned that his opinions were being monitored, that further expressions of dissent could have consequences. Bernard heard about it that evening and came to school the next day pale and quiet. When Cordelia collected notebooks on Tuesday, September 14th, Bernard's latest entry read simply, __, quote _, 21 __. But the worst came on September 17th. That afternoon, 2 FBI agents arrived at Wallace Pruitt's house. They asked him to accompany them for questioning. Wallace, a mill foreman who'd worked in Millbrook for 20 years, went peacefully, assuming it was some routine matter. He never came home. By that evening, Rebecca Pruitt was frantic. She called the sheriff, who made inquiries and reported back. Wallace was being questioned by federal authorities regarding statements he'd allegedly made criticizing government policy and war management. The investigation was ongoing. No charges had been filed. No attorney was needed yet. He would be released when the investigation concluded. How long would that take? The sheriff didn't know. Cordelia heard about Wallace's detention that same evening. A neighbor stopped by her house to tell her, knowing Cordelia taught Daphne. The neighbor was frightened, bewildered. Wallace Pruitt was no traitor, no spy. He was a hard-working man who'd sent his eldest son to fight in the Pacific, who worked double shifts at the mill producing lumber for the war effort, who'd bought more war bonds than almost anyone in town. What had he done? Cordelia knew exactly what he'd done. He'd complained about government waste at his own dinner table, and his 12-year-old daughter had written it in a blue notebook, and Cordelia had marked it as a good observation, and Silas Oakes had forwarded it to authorities, and now Wallace Pruitt was gone. She spent that night vomiting, her body rejecting what her mind had been forced to accept. She was complicit in this. She had enabled it. She had turned children into informants and families into targets. The system she'd helped implement had destroyed lives. Saturday, September 18th. Cordelia woke before dawn and walked to the school. She let herself into her empty classroom and sat at her desk, staring at the stack of blue notebooks she'd collected 2 days earlier. 41 notebooks filled with surveillance, betrayal, and fear. 3 families already damaged, and she had 3 more weeks of entries yet uncollected. How many more people would vanish before the school year ended? How many more children would she transform into weapons against their own parents? That's when she finally understood what she had to do. She couldn't just stop participating. That would draw immediate attention from Oakes, would mark her as unreliable, potentially disloyal. She needed to appear to continue while actually sabotaging the system from within. And more than that, she needed to undo the damage she'd done to those 41 children's souls. She needed to teach them that what they'd been doing was wrong, no matter what authority figures had told them. She needed to give them their conscience back. Sunday, September 19th. Cordelia walked to Maud Stevens's house. Maud was 68 years old, a widow who'd taught primary grades for 4 decades. She lived in a tiny cottage filled with books and knitting projects and the smell of lavender sachets. Cordelia sat in Maud's parlor and, for the first time since this nightmare began, told someone the full truth. She described the notebooks, the entries, the FBI visits, Wallace Pruitt's disappearance. She described her complicity, her cowardice, her growing horror. She described the trap she was in: continue and destroy more families, or refuse and face consequences. Maud listened without interruption, her lined face grave. When Cordelia finished, Maud was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Quote 23, quote 24, Cordelia asked. Quote 25, quote 26, Maud said. Quote 27, quote 28, Cordelia asked. Quote 29, quote, Maud said firmly. Quote 30, quote. Cordelia went home that evening with a plan crystallizing in her mind. It was dangerous. It would likely cost her job, possibly her freedom. But Maud was right. She'd broken something in those 41 children, and she had to fix it, whatever the price. Monday, September 20th. Cordelia taught her regular classes, but her mind was elsewhere, rehearsing what she would say, how she would frame it, what words would crack through the patriotic conditioning and reach her students' consciences. That afternoon, she made an announcement. Quote 31, quote. The students looked puzzled but nodded. Thursday was 3 days away. Tuesday and Wednesday were agony. Cordelia taught grammar and vocabulary and literature, maintained her normal routine, but every moment felt like walking a tightrope. Silas Oakes conducted one of his unannounced observations on Tuesday, standing at the back of her classroom for 30 minutes, watching, assessing. Afterward, he asked about the notebook program. She told him it was proceeding well, that she was planning a comprehensive review session on Thursday to reinforce lessons learned. He seemed satisfied. She felt like a liar and a traitor, which she supposed she was, though traitor to what remained the question. Wednesday evening, September 22nd. Cordelia barely slept. She lay in bed rehearsing her lesson plan, imagining how it would unfold, what the students would say, how Oakes would react. She knew this would be the end of her teaching career. She knew there would be consequences. But she also knew she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. Some things mattered more than safety. Some things mattered more than employment. The souls of 41 children mattered more. Thursday, September 23rd, 1943. The day everything changed. Cordelia arrived at school before sunrise. She rearranged her classroom, moving all the student desks into a circle rather than rows. She wanted the children facing each other, seeing each other, remembering they were a community. On the blackboard, she wrote in large letters, ___, quote _ 32 __. When the students arrived at 8 o'clock, they were surprised by the new arrangement. They settled into the circle, clutching their blue notebooks, curious and uncertain. Cordelia stood in the center of the circle and looked at each face in turn. 41 children. 41 young people she'd betrayed by turning them into informants. 41 chances to make things right. Quote 33. Quote. She began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Quote 34. Quote. She paused, making eye contact with students around the circle. The children nodded, some looking uncomfortable, perhaps sensing where this was leading. The silence in the room was absolute. Several students looked shocked. Others looked down at their notebooks as if seeing them for the first time. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 37, underscore, underscore. Cordelia said gently, looking at the young German-American boy in the circle. Herman's face flushed. FBI agents came to our house, he said quietly. They questioned her for 3 hours. They asked if she was loyal to America or to Germany. They asked if we had relatives who were Nazis. They made her cry. And do you know why they came? Cordelia asked. Herman shook his head, though his eyes suggested he was beginning to understand. They came because you wrote in your notebook that your mother expressed sadness about German civilians dying in bombing raids. You recorded that statement. I marked it as a good observation. Principal Oakes sent it to authorities, and they decided your mother might be disloyal. So they questioned her, frightened her, made her feel like a suspect in her own country, because you reported what she said at home. Herman's eyes filled with tears. Other students were staring at their notebooks now, realization dawning. Cordelia continued. Bernard nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. Cordelia confirmed. Then Cordelia turned to Daphne Pruitt. The girl was pale, her hands gripping her notebook so tightly her knuckles were white. Cordelia said, her voice breaking slightly, quote 49. Daphne's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know. Men came and took him away on Friday. They said it was for questioning. He hasn't come home. Mama is so scared. My little brothers keep asking when Daddy's coming back, and she doesn't know what to tell them. Your father was taken because you wrote in your notebook that he criticized government spending, Cordelia said, forcing herself to be brutally honest. You reported your own father for complaining about waste while soldiers lack supplies, a complaint millions of Americans share. But you wrote it down. I validated it. Authorities read it, and your father vanished. He hasn't been charged with any crime. He hasn't been allowed to see a lawyer. He hasn't been given a trial. He's just gone. And it happened because his 12-year-old daughter reported a dinner table conversation. Daphne was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. Other children were crying too. The horror of what they'd been doing finally penetrating. Cordelia said, raising her voice slightly. She walked to the blackboard and underlined the question. Quote, 55. Quote, 56, she said. Quote, 57. Quote. Curtis Brennan raised his hand. Quote, 58. Quote. Quote, 59. Quote, Cordelia said firmly. She paused, looking around the circle at the tear-stained faces. The room was silent except for quiet crying. Then, Maud Stevens appeared in the doorway. Cordelia hadn't asked her to come, but Maud must have known, must have understood that this moment needed witnesses. The older teacher stepped into the circle and stood beside Cordelia, a gesture of solidarity that made Cordelia's throat tighten with gratitude. Maud said, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in education. Cordelia took a deep breath. For a long moment, nobody moved. The students looked at their notebooks, at each other, at Cordelia. The weight of the decision hung in the air. Then, Daphne Pruitt stood up. Her face was wet with tears, her hands trembling, but her jaw was set with determination. She held up her blue notebook and tore the cover off. The ripping sound was loud in the silent room. Then she began tearing pages, one after another, shredding them methodically. Scraps of blue paper fell around her feet like confetti. Herman Vogt was the second to stand. He tore his notebook in half with one violent motion, then ripped the halves into quarters. Curtis Brennan stood and began shredding his notebook page by page, his face set with grim purpose. Then Bernard Fitzpatrick. Then others. Within 30 seconds, all 41 students were standing, tearing, ripping, destroying their citizen speech observation journals. Some ripped quietly, tears streaming. Others tore aggressively, angrily, as if attacking the system that had used them. The sound of ripping paper filled the room, a symphony of resistance, of rejection, of reclaimed conscience. When every notebook was destroyed, when the floor was carpeted with blue confetti, Cordelia said, quote, 65. She led the class outside, 41 children carrying armfuls of shredded paper. Behind the school building stood an old metal barrel used for burning trash. The students dumped the paper fragments into it, filling the barrel with the evidence of their surveillance, their betrayals, their coerced complicity. Cordelia pulled a box of matches from her pocket. She struck one and held it up. Quote 66, quote, she said. Quote 67, quote. Quote 68, quote. Daphne said fiercely. Quote 69, quote. Herman added. Quote 70, quote. The class said together, a chorus of 41 voices. Cordelia dropped the match. The paper caught immediately, dry and eager to burn. Flames leaped up, fed by months of surveillance and suffering. Smoke rose into the clear September morning, carrying away names and dates and private words that should never have been recorded. The children stood in a circle around the burning barrel, watching their blue notebooks turn to ash. And that's when Silas Oakes found them. He came around the corner of the building at exactly 8:47 a.m., drawn by the smoke. He stopped dead when he saw the scene. 41 students, 2 teachers, a barrel of burning paper, and unmistakable blue fragments still visible in the flames. His face went from confusion to comprehension to fury in the space of 3 seconds. "What in God's name is happening here?" he demanded, his voice sharp as a whip. "We're burning government surveillance records," Cordelia said calmly, though her heart was hammering. "These children have been used as informants against their families. That stops today." Oakes's face darkened. Quote 74, quote 75. Cordelia interrupted. Quote 76, quote 77. Oakes said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Quote 78, quote 79. Cordelia agreed, her voice steady despite her fear. Underscore underscore quote underscore 80 underscore underscore. Oakes turned his gaze to the students, clearly trying to regain control. Underscore underscore quote underscore 81 underscore underscore. Curtis Brennan stepped forward. At 12 years old, he was already nearly as tall as some adults, built solid like his farmer grandfather. Quote 82, quote, he said clearly. Quote 83, quote. Other students stepped forward, forming a protective wall between Cordelia and Oakes. Herman spoke up. Quote 84. Daphne's voice rang out, stronger than Cordelia had ever heard it. "My father has been taken somewhere. We don't know where. We don't know why, except that I reported him for criticizing government waste. He works at the mill 60 hours a week. He's helped produce more lumber for the war effort than almost anyone. And he's gone because his daughter reported a dinner table conversation. Miss Harlan taught me I shouldn't have done that, and she's right." One by one, students testified. They described what they'd reported, what had happened to their families, why they'd torn up their notebooks. They spoke with the clear-eyed honesty of children who've suddenly understood they'd been used for something ugly. Silas Oakes stood rigid, his face a mask of fury, but he was outnumbered and outflanked. 41 children, united in resistance, backed by 2 teachers, surrounded by burning evidence of his surveillance program. Finally, Oakes turned and walked back toward the school building, his posture military stiff, radiating barely controlled rage. But he was retreating, and everyone knew it. The battle, at least for this moment, was won. That evening, Silas Oakes called an emergency school board meeting. The board consisted of 5 Millbrook citizens: Samuel Garrett, a dairy farmer; Frank Hutchins, foreman at the lumber mill; Margaret Chen, who ran the general store; Dr. Theodore Walsh, the town's only physician; and Vera Kimball, a retired teacher who'd taught in Millbrook for 30 years before Maud. They assembled in the school library at 7 p.m. Oakes presented his case methodically. Cordelia Harlan had deliberately sabotaged a federally sanctioned security program, destroyed official records, and indoctrinated students with ideas that undermined wartime morale and vigilance. He recommended immediate termination and referral to federal authorities for possible prosecution. His presentation lasted 45 minutes. Then the board asked to hear from Cordelia. She told them the truth, holding nothing back. She described the notebook program, what children had been instructed to record, what had happened to families as a result. She described Herman Vogt's mother's interrogation, Bernard Fitzpatrick's uncle's loyalty review, Wallace Pruitt's disappearance. She described her own complicity, her dawning horror, her decision to stop the program the only way she could, by teaching the children that family loyalty mattered more than surveillance. She acknowledged there would be consequences. She said she didn't regret her choice. The board then asked to hear from students. Daphne Pruitt came first. She was 12 years old, small for her age, but she stood before 5 adults and spoke with heartbreaking clarity about her father's disappearance, about her family's terror, about her guilt for causing it. She said Miss Harlan had shown her that children shouldn't be turned into weapons against their parents. Herman Vogt described his mother's FBI interrogation, how she'd stopped speaking German even in private, how she flinched at unexpected sounds now. Curtis Brennan talked about how the notebooks had poisoned his relationship with his uncle, how he'd started seeing family as potential security threats rather than people who loved him. One by one, 8 students testified. The board couldn't accommodate all 41, but these 8 represented different families, different experiences, different damages inflicted by the program. And slowly, the board members' expressions changed from bureaucratic neutrality to anger. These were local people. They'd lived in Millbrook their whole lives. They knew these families. Frank Hutchins had worked alongside Wallace Pruitt at the mill for 15 years. Dr. Walsh had delivered Herman Vogt and treated his mother's various illnesses. Margaret Chen knew every family in town through her store. Samuel Garrett's daughter had been in Cordelia's class 5 years ago. Vera Kimball had taught some of these children's parents. The board deliberated for 2 hours. Voices were raised, arguments made. Frank Hutchins banged his fist on the table at one point. Finally, they emerged and announced their decision. 3 votes to retain Cordelia, Garrett, Walsh, Kimball. 2 votes to terminate her, Hutchins, Chen. Cordelia would remain as a teacher at Millbrook Elementary. However, the board also voted unanimously to suspend the Citizen Speech Observation Journal program pending review by federal authorities. The notebooks were done. Silas Oakes was furious. Over the next 2 weeks, he appealed to the district superintendent, to the County Board of Education, to the Office of War Information. But something had shifted. Word of Millbrook's notebook burning had spread. Parents in other Oregon communities began asking questions about similar programs. Were children being used as informants? Were families being investigated based on children's reports? The Portland newspapers picked up the story. Not front-page news, but a feature article in the local section. Quote, 86, The backlash was modest but real. The Office of War Information, sensitive to public opinion, issued a quiet statement that the Citizen Speech Observation Journal was, quote, 87, quote, being, quote, 88, quote, and, quote, 89, quote. They were distancing themselves, preparing to let the program die quietly rather than defend it publicly. The FBI office in Portland, which had acted on information from Millbrook's notebooks, faced uncomfortable questions about Wallace Pruitt's detention. By early October, facing no evidence of actual disloyalty and increasing pressure from local officials, they released him. Wallace Pruitt came home on October 8, 1943, 3 weeks after he'd been taken. He was thinner, quieter, marked by the experience in ways that would never fully heal. But he was home, uncharged, technically cleared. His daughter Daphne clung to him and sobbed for an hour. The Pruitt family would never speak publicly about what Wallace had endured during those 3 weeks. But Millbrook understood. He'd been punished for expressing opinions at his own dinner table, and the punishment had been administered because his child had reported him. The town's anger at the program, already substantial, became absolute. Silas Oakes left Millbrook in December 1943. Whether he was transferred, resigned, or was quietly encouraged to depart, the official records don't specify. He was replaced by a local administrator, Mr. Hawthorne, who'd been teaching in a neighboring district. The Citizen Speech Observation Journal was never mentioned again. Cordelia kept her job, though she knew she was watched. For the remainder of the school year, she taught carefully, meticulously documenting every lesson, covering curriculum precisely. But in subtle ways, she continued teaching what mattered: critical thinking, questioning authority, understanding constitutional rights, valuing truth over compliance. The war ended in August 1945. Life in Millbrook gradually returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a world forever changed. The men came home, the factories retooled, the rations ended. The Vogt family eventually relaxed, though Mrs. Vogt never fully lost her wariness. Bernard Fitzpatrick's Uncle Patrick never stopped voicing his political opinions, though his family worried about him more than before. The Pruitt family healed slowly, but Wallace Pruitt carried the scars of those 3 weeks until his death in 1967. Cordelia taught at Millbrook Elementary for another 22 years, retiring in 1967 at age 60. She never married, never left Millbrook, never sought recognition. She was simply Miss Harlan, the English teacher, respected, remembered, loved. She taught the children of her former students and occasionally the grandchildren. Every year on September 23rd, she told her 6th grade class the story of the Blue Notebooks. Not as legend, but as recent history. This is what happened. This is what we did. This is why it was wrong. This is why it must never happen again. The students from that 1943 6th grade class grew up and scattered. Some fought in Korea. Some stayed in Millbrook. Some moved away to cities. But they stayed connected, bound by shared experience. They told their children about Miss Harlan and the day they burned the notebooks. The story passed down through generations became part of family lore, part of Millbrook's identity. Daphne Pruitt became a civil rights attorney. She spent her career defending people whose constitutional rights were violated. In 1981, she published a memoir that included a chapter about the Blue Notebooks. She wrote, "My father never fully recovered from what I helped do to him. He came home physically unharmed but psychologically diminished, forever wary, forever careful about what he said even in his own house. I carry that guilt still. But Miss Harlan taught me something crucial on September 23, 1943. It's never too late to stop doing wrong. She'd participated in something terrible, and she found the courage to end it, knowing the cost. That lesson, that you can recognize your complicity and choose to resist, choose to pay the price for doing right, shaped my entire career. I became a lawyer because Miss Harlan showed me that defending people's rights matters more than following unjust orders." Herman Vogt became a teacher, eventually principal of Millbrook Elementary in 1978. He instituted a tradition that continues today. Every September 23rd, the school holds an assembly. Teachers tell incoming 6th graders the story of the Blue Notebooks. They explain what happened, why it was wrong, what Miss Harlan and the students did to stop it. The lesson is age-appropriate but unflinching. Students learn that schools are places of learning, not surveillance, that children should never be used to monitor their families, that some things, privacy, trust, family loyalty, are sacred and must be protected even when authorities say otherwise. Curtis Brennan took over his grandfather's dairy farm. He lived quietly, spoke rarely about the war years. But in 2003, at age 72, he gave an interview to an oral historian collecting World War II home front memories. He said, __quote _91 __ Cordelia Harlan died on March 15, 1989, at age 82. Her funeral filled Millbrook's community church to overflowing. Former students traveled from across the country to attend. Daphne Pruitt, by then a distinguished attorney in San Francisco, delivered the eulogy. She spoke about conscience and courage, about the quiet heroism of one woman who chose principle over safety. She ended with words from a letter Cordelia had written years earlier to a former student. "I don't want to be remembered as a hero. I want to be remembered as someone who made a terrible mistake and had the chance to partly unmake it. The real heroes were those 41 children who trusted me enough to destroy those notebooks, who chose family loyalty over governmental authority, who chose privacy over surveillance, who chose freedom over fear. I just showed them the path. They had the courage to walk it." Today, 70 years after the burning, the story lives on. It's taught in Oregon schools, studied by historians, cited in discussions about civil liberties and government surveillance. The specific program, the Citizen Speech Observation Journal, was never officially acknowledged by federal authorities. It existed in a gray zone of wartime security measures, implemented sporadically, documented minimally, abandoned quietly when it proved more trouble than it was worth. But its effects were real. Families were investigated, people were detained, trust was broken. And in at least one place, people fought back. There's a memorial now in front of Millbrook Elementary. Installed in 2003 on the 60th anniversary, it's a simple granite stone that reads, __quote_93___. Every September 23rd, the school holds a brief ceremony. Students place flowers at the stone. Someone reads from Daphne Pruitt's memoir. A teacher or community leader speaks about protecting civil liberties even during crisis. It's tradition now. An annual reminder of what can happen when surveillance is normalized, when children are weaponized, when fear overcomes values. The lesson of the blue notebooks endures. Systems of control don't announce themselves as evil. They come wrapped in patriotism, security, duty. They appeal to our best instincts. Protect the country, keep everyone safe, be vigilant. They start small. Just record some speech. Just report concerning statements. Just help us maintain security. And before you know it, children inform on parents. Neighbors report neighbors. Trust dissolves. Fear governs life. The only defense is people who say no. People like Cordelia Harlan who had courage to admit complicity and strength to resist. People like Maud Stevens who stood beside her colleague when it mattered. People like 41 sixth graders who tore up their notebooks and chose family over authority. Individual acts of resistance don't destroy systems. Cordelia's action didn't end wartime surveillance, didn't reform federal policy, didn't change national security practices. But it saved 41 children from becoming permanent informants. It saved their families from ongoing surveillance. It planted seeds of resistance that grew into collective memory, a story passed through generations, a permanent reminder of what matters. That's not victory on a grand scale, but it's victory nonetheless. Sometimes victory is just saying, __quote_95__ in one place, at one time, to one wrong thing, and trusting the ripples to spread. Cordelia Harlan's ripples are still spreading. Students across America now learn her story. They learn that ordinary people can resist extraordinary pressure. They learn that teachers have responsibilities beyond curriculum, including protecting students' moral development. They learn that some things, trust, privacy, family loyalty, are worth protecting even at great personal cost. These lessons matter. These lessons endure. May we honor Cordelia's memory by remembering them. May we honor those 41 students by teaching our children the same courage. And may we never again turn children into surveillance instruments, no matter how patriotic it sounds, no matter how urgent the crisis seems, no matter who tells us it's necessary. The blue notebooks burned 70 years ago in a metal barrel behind a small-town school. But their lesson burns bright still, a warning fire across decades, a beacon showing what we must never become again. That is Cordelia Harlan's gift to us. That is the legacy of September 23, 1943. That is the story we must never forget.